Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. I specifically would like to thank ACES DV and GOYFF for their partnership in developing this webinar. I am Galen Davis, a program administrator at the Governor's Office of Youth, Faith, and Family. Every year, as part of the Lighting Arizona Purple campaign during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, the governor lights the Capitol Dome purple, and we work on bringing awareness to domestic violence in Arizona. During this October, law enforcement, state agencies, and the Governor's Commission to Prevent Violence Against Women and other community partners continue to expand efforts to partner, collaborate, and unite in the fight against domestic violence. As part of this year's ongoing campaign, GOYFF has started a webinar series to help raise awareness about domestic and sexual violence, prevention efforts, and to show Arizona's support for victims and survivors. This webinar is the first installment of this series, and I am very excited for the presenters to share their expertise.
So we will be talking about domestic violence dynamics and the impact on children.
Quick disclaimer that all webinars and resources have been wonderfully developed by the presenters, and the views expressed in these presentations belong solely to the presenters, and they do not reflect the official policy or position of GOYFF.
Okay, so this is a collaborative effort, this presentation, just like the work we do, because we can't do it alone. Survivors and victims come to us with many needs, and we have to work together to be able to meet those needs. So we'll introduce ourselves. I'm Doreen Nicholas, the Survivor Engagement and Systems Change Specialist at the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence.
I'm Leslie Beatty, a survivor of domestic violence with the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence.
My name is Cheetah Olsen. I'm a victim advocate at the Yavapai Family Advocacy Center in Yavapai County.
So we're going to start off hearing from Leslie about her experience to kind of get us rooted in what survivors go through.
Thank you. So as stated, I'm Leslie Beatty, and I want to say thank you to all for the opportunity to share my story. I have to first add that I'm happy to be on this side of my journey as a survivor. Just a little bit of background about me. I'm a native of Charlotte, North Carolina, but I've lived in Arizona for over 20 years. I'm an experienced chemical engineer who currently uses my skill set in the healthcare industry. I have two dynamic children, 10 and 11 years old, who never fail to keep me on my toes. So I am always busy. In terms of my story, like most couples, when I decided to get married, I was in love and looking forward to creating a family and building a life with my new husband. I never imagined my journey would transform into a nightmare of trauma and disbelief. And while the relationship did not seem abusive the first few years of our marriage, looking back now, I can see that some flags were there. I just didn't notice them or even understand what they were. By the time we were divorced, we had been married close to 10 years and separated for about 1.5 years. Key markers for me, as I remained in my marriage, I began to realize something was greatly wrong a few years in. When we could not agree on anything, he was very argumentative and definitely not collaborative. And me, as a typically happy, jovial person, I found myself constantly exhausted and stressed. I felt like we were never on the same team, and as time progressed, his behavior became more volatile, erratic, and frightening. It wasn't until I went home during the summer of 2014 that I realized how toxic my environment was and how unhappy I had become. I didn't know who I was anymore, and most importantly, my children began to show behavioral signs of being affected by seeing, viewing, and experiencing the abuse. I also want to highlight that although we separated after returning from my trip home in 2014, the abuse did not stop. The abuse was on all levels: physical, emotional, psychological, verbal, as well as financial. But this time, now that we're no longer in the same house, it transformed into different ways, nonstop for close to 6 years. I will have to say, I thought my marriage was a dark period. These 6 years were probably the most darkest of my days. There were days I didn't think I could keep going. I was financially strapped. I was extremely stressed with high levels of anxiety. I couldn't sleep. My constant dealings with DCS, law enforcement, and the court system, as well as people who I thought were friends and showed themselves to not really be friends, were more than I could bear at times. My children were greatly affected. From regression to depression, they struggled socially as well as within themselves, and they constantly wondered what they did to cause these things to happen. So I have to say, I kept going. Despite the what I would consider losses, despite what I would think would be failures, despite the no's in court, I continued to keep going. Despite the harassment and the abuse and the trauma, I continued to keep going, and I did not give up. And so I'll go back to my very first statement earlier is I'm happy to be on this side of my journey as a survivor and to be able to share this with everyone. Thank you.
So as we continue on and talk about the dynamics, I want you to keep Leslie's experience in mind. I think it'll resonate with you. So when we talk about dynamics, we talk about mostly this pattern of control that abusers use, these different tactics that you see in this wheel. And I'm gonna cover this generally, then I'm gonna ask Leslie to give some specifics for these tactics. But if you look at this wheel like those old wooden wagon wheels we have around Arizona, with the outside the physical and sexual violence being the metal strip, if you will, that holds the wooden spokes together, then the hub being power and control. You can see the tactics, the emotional abuse, the sexual coercion and harassment, using technology, and that's getting more and more common and has been the last 20 years as technology advances. Intimidation, minimizing, denying, or blaming the abuse, using threats, using privilege, using isolation and economic abuse. You know, we often get asked or hear comments about, you know, that, well, he or she should have known, or they should have seen it coming. But if you look at all these tactics on the inside of this wheel, they have one thing in common. You can do all these things to somebody without touching them. And this development of this pattern of abuse sometimes can be so subtle, and it's really hard to describe it. It's really easy to describe when somebody punches you or when somebody holds a gun to your head. But unless you've been exposed to this terminology and these tactics clearly, you probably wouldn't hear me and Cheetah having a conversation like, you know, Cheetah, I think my partner's trying to isolate me from my supportive network of my family members and friends. You know, we would get calls at the shelter all the time and people would say, you know, he or she hasn't hit me, but things aren't good at my house. So I would explore that things aren't good at my house anymore. And what I would usually get would be some description of one of these tactics, like isolation or controlling the money or name calling, those kind of things. We really need to understand that domestic violence is more than a black eye. And Leslie, I want to invite you, if you would, to give some examples of some of these tactics as it played out in your relationship.
Absolutely. So you were spot on. I mean, physical violence is usually the go-to when people think of domestic violence. And I'll start there. There was some physical violence, but not as extreme as what you hear about in the news typically. The physical violence was more about him using his body. He's a much bigger person than myself, and he would use his body to block doors and coerce me into a room by kind of moving me with his big arm, and he'd block me from the kids, and then he'd snatch keys or whatever item was in my hand. But most importantly, it went from the physical, and that got progressively worse And then there was the yelling, and that started early in our marriage, the yelling and just constantly just yelling and screaming at me whenever things weren't the way that he wanted them to be, and using harmful language, which goes to that emotional abuse, the name calling, you're a horrible mother, you're a horrible wife. And the guilt tripping, if you make a mistake, he would blow it up so much that you think, this was something you could not really get over. He would also use social standing, and that's basically like making all the decisions. So no matter how much we'd agree on something, he would make all the financial decisions. In addition to that, he would say what he should do. He would define roles. So as a husband, he should do this, and as a wife, I had to do this, or as a mother, this was my role. But it was never a discussion, and eventually you feel backed into a corner. But the interesting thing was he would define these roles with no collaboration or agreement, but he would never uphold his end of the bargain for the roles that he defined for himself. Using technology was very interesting because, iPhones have the Find My iPhone app. In a normal, healthy relationship, you may just use that to find your own phone. But in a toxic relationship where someone's abusive, they use that to stalk you. And I didn't realize that that was happening until much later. In addition, once we were apart, technology was used to harass me. So I would get sometimes 4 to 5 messages, text messages of harassing, contentious, name calling type of text messages. And it would be a trigger, so much so that I would have to put my phone on silent. And eventually I got an order of protection that minimized or limited the number of text messages he could send, and also defined the scope of what could be discussed in those text messages. I went over the using intimidation. The minimizing, denying, and blaming was very prevalent during that time. Anything that would happen, he'd flip the situation, minimize the impact of the abuse, and actually try to make it my fault. For instance, this would not happen if you had done, just to qualify his behavior. And then I'll give a few more. The exclusion, which is the isolation. I think that's like the first part that you don't necessarily realize. I think Doreen mentioned this, being isolated from my family who didn't live here. So whenever my mother would come out and visit, he would be so rude and mean to her, to the point where eventually, I think in 2013, she said she was never coming back. And then just not being around my friends. I lived so far away from them. I used to live maybe 20 minutes away, and I moved maybe 45 minutes away. So our lives were different. And it got to the point where I really wasn't going out. It wasn't, I just wanted to be alone. And before you know it, you're stuck with the yelling and the voices and whatever he's saying to maintain that power and that control. I think that those are some pretty vivid explanations to share, but the power and control wheel is it can be a tangible and intangible thing when people are trying to assess what's happening to them. At least it was for me.
And for those of you that may or do work directly with victims, you can find this power and control wheel in English and Spanish on our website at acesdv.com. And you can also find an equality wheel in English and Spanish that will help you have discussions about what healthy relationships look like. Thank you so much, Leslie.
Oh, no problem.
So let's talk about who victims are. And I think, if we were doing an in-person training and the room was full, I usually would tell people to look around the room at each other. And usually it's a mixture and a very diverse group of people, men and women, and, people that identify differently. But when we are in a group of people, that's who victims are, because it can happen to anybody. It doesn't discriminate based on gender, race, or ethnicity, or religion, or age, or sexual orientation, or class, education, your ability status, or legal status. There's not a universal set of characteristics or personality traits for victims. And because victims are not easily recognized, they're not usually covered in marks or bruises. Like Leslie said, and you know, the physical abuse many times is so just a small part of this whole pattern of control. And, you know, people still look for that black eye, and you're not always going to see it. Perpetrators are really good at making sure that the injuries or the bruises are in places where clothing can cover it. However, if you do see black eyes or facial injuries, obvious injuries, I would submit to you that that's when it's getting dangerous, when the abusive party is abusing to the point where it's visible on someone. A lot of victims, by the same token, have learned to conceal those injuries to avoid detection, suspicion, or shame. And one of the big barriers for victims is many times the very people they reach out to for help might blame them or stigmatize them. So some are very hesitant to reach out for help. And when we talk about who are the people doing the harm, again, if we're in a room together, I'd invite you to look around the room, and we're looking at them. People who do harm can be anyone. Again, of any group, any gender, race, ability, status, just like victims. People who do harm are not always angry and hostile. They can be real charming, very agreeable and kind. Usually there's a much different persona outside the household than there is inside the household. They do differ in patterns of abuse and levels of dangerousness. Most people who do harm do share the following. One, they'll abuse their power in the relationship, whether it's as a partner or a parent. They will have different public and private behavior, like I said. They'll project blame. They may minimize or deny the abuse, like Leslie gave us an example of, and they rarely take responsibility. But people who do harm do need support and intervention to end that violent behavior, and if they have any other additional problems that might compound that behavior. So we need to make sure that we do outreach and good service provision for the people who do harm. And it's important for us to understand the barriers that survivors have when they try to leave a relationship. I mean, first and foremost, we know that almost 100% of domestic violence victims experience some level of financial abuse. So sometimes just having money or access to money is a big barrier. You know, if I don't have access to money or a credit card, I've been allowed to work, how am I going to take care of myself and my children? How am I going to get a house? How am I going to put gas in the car? You know, being able to access housing during this pandemic, our shelter capacity has been cut in half because of health and safety issues and social distancing. Children being pregnant by the other party, that might be a barrier, especially if you are committed to, you know, keeping the family together, making sure your kids have a two-parent household, etc. Employment, you might need to move, and that means you have to quit your job. You might be very dedicated to your career or a loyal employee, or you've been a stay-at-home parent and haven't worked in a while and are trying to figure out how you're going to get a job that brings in enough to take care of yourself and your children. You might live someplace where there's a general lack of resources, or, you know, like Leslie, you moved away from family members and friends, so you don't have that social support. You might be experiencing some kind of disability and your partner is your caregiver. And, you know, so a barrier would be, who's going to take care of me? Who's going to help me get to my doctor's appointments or take my treatment or my medication? Your culture or your religion might be a barrier. We know a lot of faith-based communities, you know, really try to keep the family together at all costs, and that can be a challenge sometimes. We know that some groups have a fear of police and authority. We find that to be particularly pronounced in our refugee and immigrant community. Geography, where you live, might be a barrier. You might live in a very rural part of the state. You don't have access to transportation. So that might be a very real barrier for you. You might have pets and you might have a place to go, but you can't take your pets with you. So one of the things we've been doing at the coalition is working with the programs around the state over the last year so they can make accommodations for people's pets. Somebody's legal status, we have a lot of undocumented survivors in Arizona, and we hear from them that they're very afraid to reach out because they don't know what to expect or if they'll get help. We might be concerned about the escalation of abuse, because one of the things that we know is when you try to end the relationship or leave or try to resist the abuse and control, is sometimes it really escalates during that time. For those of us in relationships, we really try our best many times to believe our partner's promises. Many times our partners will promise to change, promise to be a better partner, parent, etc. And we believe that. We want it to work out. Sometimes who the partner is a barrier. What if your partner is a well-respected member of the community, in a high position? Sometimes that's a barrier. Our systems that survivors have to navigate are very complicated. Our Department of Economic Security system, our access system, the court system, it's all very complicated. And then a lot of survivors are struggling with confusion about what to do next and what are the next steps. And then sometimes the trauma that they've experienced really negatively impacts them. Many of them experience fear and shame. And most folks still love their partner and have hope against hope that things will work out. So I think it's important that we keep these barriers in mind when we're working with someone. So we're more understanding, we're not as judgmental, we can really be there for people. And one of the things that me and other advocates have figured out, that a lot of the things that we can provide for survivors, that we can give to survivors, are not things that could be seen. What they tell us they need the most is that to be heard, that we hear them. When they talk to us, that we hear them and try to understand. They need to feel safe. They don't want to be judged or further marginalized. They want to feel like their lived experience should be front and center as they create their own map forward. And, to be respected for what they've survived. Some folks have survived things that many of us can't even imagine. They want to be provided with access to resources that they choose, not what others choose for them. They want to understand that not all hands are dangerous, and to have the opportunity to choose how and when they will be touched or hugged, to set their own pace, knowing that the path to healing is marked by twists and turns that can come out of nowhere. They want to be seen as capable individuals who are strong and wise, and to know that they deserve to live lives of peace, dignity, and self-determination. And that's just for starters. That's not even talking about accessible, affordable housing, an appropriate response from law enforcement, the courts, etc. But I have to give a shout out to my friend Kit Grell from North Carolina. She's an advocate there that I've worked with for years, and she's wonderful, and we brainstormed and put this list together. So shout out to Kit. So, Cheetah?
All right, thank you, Doreen. I want to just thank Doreen and Leslie and Galen for putting this on. I think the PowerPoint looks awesome. So just to introduce myself just real quickly, my name is Cheetah Olsen. I'm a victim advocate with the Yavapai Family Advocacy Center up here in Yavapai County. Just a little bit of background on me is I actually came into this profession because of a personal experience in our own family where I lost my sister to a murder-suicide almost about 25 years ago. So it's been a while, but it's something that when you go through something like that as a family, you lose your sister, your mom, your daughter, to the hands of a domestic violence partner, it leaves an impression. So I think that's definitely why I have such a passion to help women and children kind of move forward through these times in their own lives. So anyways, that's just a little bit about me. Thank you, Doreen, for doing that wheel. Just want to share real quick with the U.S. Department of Justice defines domestic violence as a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another intimate partner. I think that's just really important for us to remember that oftentimes when we see domestic violence, it's really not about the physical act of it, it's about the power and control. So when we talk about the wheel and how that really, you see so many of those behaviors that are unseen, as Doreen and Leslie talked about. We can't see a lot of the things that happen because it's really about the power and control. It's about how we make others feel. So I just thought that was such a really great definition from the U.S. Department of Justice. Just want to share some numbers with you. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention states that there is a 45% to 60% chance of co-occurring child abuse, which is a rate 15 times higher than the national average. So those children that are living in a home with domestic violence they're at a 15% or 15 times, at a rate 15 times higher than the national average to experience domestic violence. The CDC report indicates also that children witness 68 to 80% of DV in their home. We're going to touch on that just a little bit later. That's an estimated 15.5 million children in the United States who grow up in a home where there's intimate partner violence. And when you break that down, it's really about a third of children by the age of 17 in the United States have somehow witnessed domestic violence in their home, which is pretty high when you consider that a third is 1 out of 3, right? So like as Doreen was saying earlier, if you look around a room and it doesn't choose like this one or that one, it's 1 out of 3 people standing in a room could definitely be a victim of domestic violence. So children and youth who are exposed to domestic violence experience emotional, mental, and social damage that can affect their developmental growth. So when you think about children who are living in a home that is safe and secure, it's going to look very different. The emotional response from children that are living in a domestic violence atmosphere are going to be very different from children who have a safe environment. These are some numbers, and if you follow along the slide, they're 10 times more likely to live in a violent relationship when they are adults. So if you ever wonder if, as a child, if they overcome, they do and they can and we're going to share a little bit about that too as to how we help children overcome, but with no support, they can be 10 times more likely to live in a violent relationship as an adult as well. They're more likely to have social, emotional, cognitive, and psychological consequences. They're more likely to have behavioral difficulties and conflict with other children. They're likely to have poor academic performance and difficulty in concentrating. And they're also likely to develop attitudes and learn behaviors that perpetuate the cycle of violence. Again, that's where we see that them being 10 times more likely to live in a relationship that is violent as an adult. Externalized symptoms of children's exposure to domestic violence. And these, when we talk about externalized symptoms, of course, these are the things that we can see. We'll talk a little bit also about the internalized symptoms of children's exposure to domestic violence, but these are the things that we could see either as a parent, we might see it as a teacher. If you have a child in your classroom that is experiencing domestic violence at home, you might see some of these symptoms, if you will, playing out in your classroom or playing out in your preschool or in your daycare. And some of those would be aggression. So a child who is excessively aggressive with other children lowers social competence, including less empathy with others. If they're not learning some of those social cues at home, they're less likely to be able to show those social cues to other children. So including less empathy would make sense then. They might have lower verbal, cognitive, and motor abilities. Their brains are so inundated with what's going on at home, the fear that they're experiencing, that it kind of blocks that cognitive ability to understand and the motor abilities as well. You might see restlessness, impulsivity, and difficulty concentrating, which also goes back to the fact that their little brains can't handle all the toxicity that's going on around them. You might see behavioral and academic difficulties in school. Again, if they can't concentrate in school, if they're hungry, if they're hurting, if they're thinking about how mom has been abused, or if they're fearful for going home, of course, they're going to have a hard time really concentrating in school. So therefore, you're going to see that in their grades, reflected in their grades. They might have immaturity. There's delays in development and regression to earlier developmental stages. And we'll kind of look at that too, as to what it looks like for each child or each age group. Internalized symptoms of children's exposure to domestic violence, these are the things that we wouldn't be able to see. These are the things that we might capture little glimpses of, like with depression, anxiety, hypervigilance. Those children that seem, if they hear a door slam and they jump, it might be something that where they have seen that or they've heard it at home. So therefore they might jump. They might be a little bit more hypervigilant than other children that are not experiencing domestic violence in their houses. They could be fearful. They could be withdrawn and have an inhibited behavior. So those children that aren't playing and being silly and being joyful on the playground, and you see them that they're more withdrawn, they don't know how to build relationship, they're fearful of other people. Those could definitely be signs of internalized symptoms of a child being exposed to domestic violence. You definitely might see lower self-esteem, shame, and feeling responsible for the abuse. And that is something that I think even as adults we can take on, where we feel responsible for somebody else because maybe we didn't help them, we didn't do our part. And if you can imagine as a child, if they're watching their mother being abused, they can definitely ask themselves, did I do this to bring this onto my mom or on the other side of my dad? Because we do see abuse on both sides. It's not just women that are abused, but also men. So there might be something where a child might be thinking to themselves, did I cause dad to do this or mom to do this because I came home and I didn't clean the room, or I messed up this or the other. So definitely watching for signs of that too. Those are internalized symptoms. We also see post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. When we look at and we break down some of the ages, the age groups, I think it's important to understand that all children are affected. It's not just going to be the elementary age, it's not just going to be the high school, but you definitely even see it in infants or preschool. So like I said, we're going to talk about a little bit about how we think that we're hiding the abuse, but children are, they're witnessing more than we might think they're witnessing. And even infants and preschoolers they're seeing it, they're living it right alongside the women that are, or the men that are in these abusive situations. So in infants, just to highlight a few things, some of the emotions that you might see in them are panic or anxiety. They might have anxious attachments to both parents. They don't want to let go. They don't know how to be alone. There's definitely that separation anxiety for them. They might numb their emotions or be extremely irritable. They might be re-experiencing trauma or even having prolonged grief. The cognitive side of that is having the short-term memory, limiting understanding of violence, right? They have concerns about disruptions of routines. So these are, a lot of times when a woman is in a domestic violence situation, her routines, there's not a natural routine oftentimes where children can follow. And of course those routines can oftentimes create a sense of safety. Well, that's all disrupted when there's when there's violence in a home. And they also want families reunited. So preschool children especially, they want their mommy and daddy, and they really oftentimes cannot disassociate from the fact of, this is my dad, even though they abused my mom. They don't get angry with dad. That's their father, so they want to be with them. Social behaviors for infants and preschoolers that you might see in a situation like this are social withdrawal, loss of developmental skills. So you might see a child who that you potty trained them and all of a sudden they're bedwetting again, or you took away their binky, but now all of a sudden they're starting to pick that up again. So you might start noticing them going back to some of those earlier developmental areas for them as well. And you could see nightmares, sleep disturbances, flashbacks, which of course you can see across the board from preschoolers and school age children, and also increased arousal or attention problems or hypervigilance. Going on to elementary age, you might start seeing a little bit more as far as like if you are witnessing as a teacher or an advocate or anyone else who might work with children, you might see in an elementary age, you might see that their emotions, right? Their emotions, you could see maybe that they're depressed or they're sad or they feel worried all the time. Again, the guilt and the shame comes in. They feel helpless, maybe even feel responsible for what's going on. You might see that they distrust adults. And I'm not going to cover all of these, just like I did on the other one, just for the sake of time. Hopefully you're able to see our PowerPoint. With cognition, they might have a problem concentrating or memory deficits because there's so much going on in their little minds that they're forgetting things. They have intrusive thoughts and images of violence. That's something that can be very detrimental to a child, is that instead of dreaming for their future or playing, you know, like a child that would have natural play, instead they're having intrusive thoughts of images of violence, fantasies of rescuing a family or their mom or whoever it might be. As a behavior in school, for instance, is they might start declining in their grades. They might have inhibited or passive social behavior. They could also be maybe a little bit more aggressive or disobedient, right? They might have an issue where they can't follow rules. They just feel completely out of kilter, if you will. Reenactment of trauma in talk and play therapy, or even in playing with friends, that you might see them start pushing other kids around or behaving the way that they're actually witnessing at home. Those are definitely signs that we see also. In adolescence, now we all know that adolescence is hard as it is. There's no doubt about that, that when you are a teenager, that in itself is hard. So if you add the domestic violence on top of with the adolescents, I think it can be a real recipe for disaster for them, because they're going through so much already just through their hormonally and with their friends, and they're starting to separate from adults. So there could be a lot of what you might see is on the emotional side is, you know, again, the self-blaming, the guilt, the shame. But now it might escalate to suicidal ideation. That's when we really have to be watching for those kids and watching to make sure that they're having an outlet for all those feelings. You might see depression and hopelessness. Again, the lack of empathy for others, where they've not been taught those social skills. They may not know how to have empathy for others, and they might start bullying others themselves. They might start getting violent towards schoolmates or friends. Cognitively, again, they have those intrusive thoughts and images of violence. They have a problem with concentration and, again, with memory. You know, if you give them a test and they can't seem to get their mind wrapped around that, some of those simple things like in history or whatever it might be, it could also be because they're remembering things that are going on at home. Then at this point too, they might start thinking that assault is normal. If they've been living through this for a long enough time, they might believe, you know, that what is normal in their home, this is what happens at home. They start that starts building into them that this is a normal behavior. And again, you'll start seeing that they start blaming others for their own behavior. So they're not taking responsibility. And again, it's almost like they're duplicating what they're seeing at home. As far as their behavior, again, you're going to see the decline in school performance. At this age, as teenagers and up to, you know, 17, 18, truancy, they're starting to run away from home. They could have increased risky sexual activity, putting themselves in places where it could be harmful for them. You could start seeing a use of substance, you know, where they're using whatever that substance might be, whether it be alcohol or marijuana or even worse, right? You might see antisocial behavioral issues. They could become explosive and violent, and with those interpersonal behaviors. And they might also start being violent in their own dating relationships. So as you can see, domestic violence really affects our children, but I don't want to leave you guys on a negative. So I promise I will try to send this on a positive as much as I can. Into adulthood, I wish that we could say that, you know, when you turn 18, there's a magic number that all of a sudden you forget everything that happened to you. But unfortunately, with 65 million adults having been exposed to domestic violence, that's just not going to happen, right? Sometimes we're going to start seeing symptoms of depression, or we will see anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. Because those are the things that have been reported in adults who have been exposed to domestic violence. So it doesn't stop when you're a child. Those things kind of carry on into your adulthood. And here's what I wanted to kind of talk about a little bit is that I've heard, you know, personally as a victim advocate, I've heard parents say to me, but they haven't witnessed it. They haven't seen the abuse, or we have hidden it behind closed doors. And I can tell you right now that, and even as the statistics state, 68 to 80% of children, they do witness what's going on behind closed doors. They are affected by it. So even when parents say they don't see it, they haven't heard it, statistics say otherwise, that children really are seeing it, and it's affecting who they are, whether we want to realize that or not. So that's important to know. I want to leave you with a positive, and you can go to Futures Without Violence. This is an awesome website that you can go to. You can get some of those resources. But how we can help is, I think one of the biggest things is that we can make those children feel safe. They've got to know that there is a safe place for them to go where they can talk. Let them talk about their feelings. Let them talk about their fears. Teach them about boundaries. Give them a good support system. Find them counseling. Be there for these kids. And it doesn't have to end where every adult that's been exposed to domestic violence, that they now forever have to live with that, and it has to change who they are. So there is hope out there. I am so glad that Leslie is on our webcast today, because I think she's an awesome example of the fact that, yes, you can be in this situation, but I would love to hear from her too as to how her moving forward in her life, how it's affected her children, and where they have come out just, I'm sure, champions and no longer victims, but survivors. Thank you for letting me share.
One more slide for you, Cheetah. Talk about, here's your contact information.
Okay. Yes. For anyone that's up in Yavapai County or moving to Yavapai County, my name is Cheetah. I am a victim advocate up here. We are the only family advocacy center in our county. So we serve a lot, if you can imagine. We're all the way from Baghdad to Ash Fork to Sedona and to Black Canyon City. So we cover a large territory. And so we help victims of domestic violence, of sexual assault. We have counselors, we have legal advocacy. So anybody ever looking for resources from us, please feel free to email me at cheetah@yfac.org, or as you can see my phone number there, 928-775-0669. And I'd be happy to connect you with resources in our county. And if I can't help you here, I will find the help that you need somehow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cheetah. Leslie, did anything come up for you when Cheetah was talking about the impact on kids that you might have seen with your children?
Oh, absolutely. I don't know if we can go back to the slide that talks about the infant, the cognitive behaviors, if we go back to elementary age or infant. Okay, so there's a lot that stands out. So really in every column, I witnessed different behaviors, and I'll just highlight two things. With my daughter, she's the oldest, and apparently when you don't think these young kids witness it or are affected, they really are, because she was able to connect the dots. And even so much as I think a couple of days ago, she mentioned to me an incident where her dad was trying to force me to bathe our son and began to push me. And I didn't know that she saw that. I didn't know she witnessed that. And she said to me, well, Mom, I ran into my room because I was afraid. And so they definitely see things, they hear things, they internalize things, they are absolutely affected. How it showed up with her was depression. There was a point where she didn't want to get out of the bed. She did not want to go to school. She just was not that happy little girl anymore. And, but then at the same time, she was so brave. So she was unfortunately put into a situation where she actually had to speak to a detective about what happened when she witnessed some abuse, physical abuse towards me. And so she was brave, she was courageous. And then after she had, it wasn't testified, but she gave her account, she had to go back to her dad's. And he basically told her she lied. She had to deal with that. So these children, I mean, they're so precious, but they go through so much. My son, he focused inward. So for him, he's not really a boy of a lot of words. He will say what he needs to, but he decided he would just focus on school. But he had a lot of anxiety. He went to the bedwetting when he was younger, so he was fine. He was potty trained and everything was going well at night. And then voila, he witnessed abuse and he went back to bedwetting and he had a lot of anxiety. What I did, not only did I get help for myself to get through the trauma and heal, I also got help and services for them. So they too then went and spoke with the therapist to talk through the things that they have been through. And I will also say getting stability. I mean, the courts were able to see, fortunately, in my situation, what's in the best interest of the kids. And I was awarded primary custody, but they now have that stability. And even with COVID, we're home, but they now have that loving environment. They get the attention they need. And I will tell you, my daughter's in a different school and they are absolutely doing phenomenal. I mean, there's still a lot of growth there, but they're doing extremely well given what they've gone through and experienced. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. And this tool here that we shared with you, the Everyday Magic 16 Ways Adults Can Support Children, it's wonderful. You can find it and download it in PDF format for free. And it's a good tool to use, you know, professionally or with your own children if they've experienced trauma. So we want to make sure that you have some resources in these last couple minutes. We have a sexual and domestic violence services helpline. So you can call and talk to somebody, or they do chat. A lot of people do chat and texts, and our advocates do that. You can get referrals about domestic and sexual violence services, systems, you know, assistance in navigating the systems. And we also have some funding for financial assistance, our Survivor Emergency Relief Fund. Whatever people need to achieve safety and healing. So call and talk to one of our advocates. If somebody needs a gas card because they just got hired at a new job and they don't get a paycheck for 2 weeks, we can help with that kind of stuff. So give us a call there. We also want you to know that we've got many, many different kinds of services because not everybody needs shelter. Some people have their own house. Some people, the apartments, the leases in their name. So we've got a great service array in Arizona. We've got mobile advocacy where somebody would meet you in your community. One gal said that, you know, she was working with someone in a small rural community and there wasn't any coffee shop or any place to hang out, or else it's during COVID and there just wasn't any place they could go. So they did their advocacy sessions in the van, driving up and down the road and around the block. So, you know, mobile advocacy is a service available. Any advocate on the helpline, hotline, mobile advocacy or otherwise does safety planning with survivors that they work for. Some of the programs will do statewide mobile advocacy and even transport, say somebody from our program in the Valley up to Cheetah's program for her community if they want to go up there, or vice versa. Cheetah's working with someone at the Yavapai Family Advocacy Center. They want to get out of Yavapai County. Some programs will help with the transport to get that person from, Amplify Family Advocacy Center to a program down here. A lot of places have 24-hour crisis response. Some offer everything but shelter, case management, support groups, legal advocacy, court accompaniment. Some programs have a pet companion shelter, so someone can leave and bring their pet with them. There are a lot of support groups around the Valley, especially now during COVID, a lot of virtual support groups. There's healing and trauma-informed yoga and other services available, lay and legal advocacy programs, family advocacy centers like Cheetah works at, and then a lot of programs provide general advocacy and support. So we want to make sure that you have those. And you know, you can get on our webpage at the Coalition and look at our safety planning tool, safety planning during COVID. You know, these last 7 months, we've had to change the way we do business. We can do it safer and more effectively with less resources in some cases. So I know that we had a conversation early on in the pandemic, Leslie, and you remarked about, I think it was imagining what it must be like for survivors who are isolated with their abusive partners. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Some of those thoughts that went through your head, and if you were still with your abusive husband, X, Y, and Z.
From the standpoint of what I think they're experiencing.
What you think they're experiencing and what it might have been like for you had you still been with him during the pandemic.
What it might have been like for me. So in a way, it was kind of a simulated environment because he wasn't working. So I was working from home. And so for people who are, I call it stuck in the house with their abusive partner, it feels claustrophobic because you really don't get that relief that you would get if you were leaving home to go to work. And you probably, I feel like victims are probably feeling like they don't have any recourse, or they can't get a break because they're constantly experiencing the abuse. What I will say, and if they have children, that makes it harder as well, because they're probably trying to be very careful with how they interact with their abuser so that they don't trigger that person, because the kids are in close quarters with them as well. I will say this though, you know, some things that a person can do when they find themselves in that situation, now that it's cooling off in Arizona, try to go for a walk, just to kind of get out and breathe some fresh air, and try to get your mind right, because the power and control piece is about the mental as well. I mean, it's really controlling the mind and every aspect of who you are.
Thank you very much. So, you know, looking at the way COVID has impacted those safety issues is what we've been doing these past 7 months, especially in the early months, because we were getting those phone calls that, you know, where somebody was trapped at home with their abusive partner after the lockdowns and the stay-at-home orders, or, you know, people weren't going into work, and going into work or going to school may well have been where they got support. They were able to get a break from whatever was going on at home. They might have been able to make the phone calls to check out what services were available. On our helpline, we were getting these short 20-second whispered calls. So, you know, we assumed that somebody was able to go for a walk or maybe get into the bathroom and make a quick call to get some information. So we just want you to be aware of how the dynamics change depending on what's going on. And we want to leave you with some ideas on how to help and support. It's, you know, survivor after survivor after survivor has told me for the past 30 years that how important it is that we listen to them, how important it is that we try to understand what's happening with them, that we demonstrate compassion, that we at least act like we care, that we believe them. I mean, some of us have been lucky enough not to go through any of this stuff. Some of us have a hard time imagining one person doing it to another person, but it happens. Just because it hasn't happened to you doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So believe them until you have a reason not to. It's really important not to judge or shame them, they've been getting that from their abusive partner. They don't need to get that from the people they reach out to for help. Let them know they're not alone. You know, one of the most powerful healing tools that I know of is a support group. You know, just getting on, well, we're doing it virtually now, but just getting on the support group or attending a support group, you immediately know you're not alone, that you're not the only one that this is happening. Don't try to take over and tell them what to do. Do not tell them what to do. Because, you know, you're telling them what to do out of your life lens, your life experience. It's probably not going to fit what's going on with their life. So don't take over, provide emotional support. And it's really important to know the resources in your community. You know, knowing about the Yavapai Family Advocacy Center, knowing about the helpline, getting on our website at acesdv.org or at the governor's office. There's all kinds of resources posted. At the very least, know where to find the resources. And Galen, if you could wrap us up, I want to let everybody know I appreciate you taking the time and effort to listen to us today. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. I do really appreciate hearing from you, Leslie, also from Cheetah, just hearing about the expertise, the resources that are in the community. And I do want to just also point out that, like Doreen mentioned, we do have our Governor's Office of Youth, Faith, and Family has an extensive resource list that you can also peruse. It is on itcanstop.az.gov. And thank you all so much for listening in.